I'm old enough to remember when going to a sports game or a concert was a simple matter of buying a ticket, presenting it to a ticket taker, and entering the venue. But here's what my experience is like today, going to a hockey game in California in the year of our Lord 2021. First, I have to stand in a line to have my bodily fluids collected and tested for the presence of a virus that I recovered from over 12 months ago. Then I have to stand around for 12 to 15 minutes until I get the text message that confirms I don't have the virus that I recovered from over 12 months ago. Then I get to finally go stand in the line where one presents one's medical records for inspection so that one can then be allowed into the event that one already bought a ticket for. Eventually, I make my way to the front door where I have to of course, empty out my pockets into a little plastic bin and step through a metal detector. And now, last night, for the first time since our distinguished governor, in his infinite greasiness and wisdom, has reimposed a statewide face diaper mandate, I got the additional bonus of the metal detector lady asking, "Do you have your mask?" So I angrily waved my stupid face diaper at her and said, "Yes, I've got my stupid face diaper." And she goes, "Okay, that's great." And I said, "No, it's not great. It's the opposite of great." So now, at long last, after all those hoops have been jumped through and all those hurdles cleared, I finally have earned the right to give my ticket to the ticket taker and thus be admitted into the venue. So we get to our seats. There's still 10 minutes to go until face-off, give or take. People are still filtering in. I've still had my stupid obedience muzzle in my pocket since I waved it at the metal detector lady. I never actually put it on my face, and as I'm looking around the section, when we first arrived, there were probably 20 people there, and I can't see that any of them is wearing a stupid obedience muzzle. So, out of all the equally unmasked people in the section, which one of them has two thumbs and gets singled out by the security guy for individualized harassment? This guy! I feel a rapping on my shoulder, and then an apologetic voice says, "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm gonna have to ask you to put your mask on." And how did I respond? Well, I responded just like this. And eventually he went away. I never took the stupid mask out of my pocket, but I guess he'll get the last laugh when I become the first person to die from the dreaded Omicron variant, the silent killer, so sneaky, so insidious, you can't even tell when the victims die. Now, Jim Eagle, I know you're pissed that I'm making you work on Saturday, but could I trouble you to please hit the music, you gloomy bastard? From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the law says you can only be forced to wear a mask if you're extremely ugly, like freakishly ugly, like late period Rosie O'Donnell ugly. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program, the Saturday special, as a matter of fact. I hope your weekend is off to a delightful and edifying start, and I hope you're having better luck with your Christmas shopping than your host has been. It seems like I've run into a bit of a catch-22, in fact. You see, I wanted to get around the supply chain crisis by getting some swim fins so I could paddle out to the container ship and get what I needed, but then the bastards tell me I can't buy the swim fins because they're on the same container ship. Only in Joe Biden's America, I tell you. And speaking of Joe Biden, our dear leader is doing his best to keep everyone's spirits up this holiday season. He gave a cheery, uplifting speech yesterday in which he declared that unvaccinated Americans can look forward to, quote, "a winter of severe illness and death for both you and your loved ones." In other words, if you don't go and get the shot, says Joe Biden in his best impression of jolly old Saint Nick, everyone you love is going to die a terrible, painful, agonizing death, and it's going to be all your fault. So Merry Christmas, boys and girls. Ho, ho, freaking ho. So I was posting in some comment thread somewhere recently, and there was a leftist troll on the thread doing what leftist trolls do, vomiting out the usual canards about what an irredeemably racist country we are, how we're founded on white supremacy, and we've never made any progress on race relations these last 400 years. And you've heard this shtick before, you know how the song goes, and it's like I always say, when things don't warrant the dignity of serious rebuttal, they shouldn't receive serious rebuttal. But once in a while, every so often, I'll throw out a serious rebuttal just to see what sort of reaction, if any, it gets. So on this occasion, just for the heck of it, I replied to one of this person's comments by saying, yeah, we are such a racist country that the most widely beloved American of the last 50 years was a black Muslim who was born in the Jim Crow South and died 74 years later in an America where a black man was the president. Perhaps not surprisingly, I didn't get any response from the troll. They quickly split and headed for greener pastures, as they often do. But I like to think maybe just for a fleeting moment, I caused a small attack of self-awareness. Because when you go all in on this narrative that's been so fashionable these past few years, this narrative that says America, oh, it's so racist, and there's no way to make it unracist, so, oh, well, I guess we'll just have to tear the whole system down, then you're denigrating and discounting the work of a lot of black Americans who devoted their lives, and sometimes gave their lives, to the cause of making the country do a better job of living up to the aspirational ideals that animated its founding. If black Americans have never made any progress, if we are no more just and equitable a society today than we were on day one, then Frederick Douglass's life didn't matter. Harriet Tubman's life didn't matter. Booker T. Washington's life didn't matter. Joe Louis's life didn't matter. Jackie Robinson's life didn't matter. And Muhammad Ali's life didn't matter either. It's been 5.5 years already since Ali's death, which seems difficult to believe. And on the day he expired, there were few people anywhere who would have argued the point that he was probably the most famous and most beloved person on the planet. And if you'd told somebody that in 1964, right after Cassius Clay, as he was then, had taken the title off of Sonny Liston, and then announced his membership in the Nation of Islam and changed his name to Muhammad Ali. If you had told someone that this man would eventually die as the most widely admired man in the world, they would have slapped you and said you were crazy, because from that person's perspective in 1964, you were talking about the most hated man in America, which he was, and it wasn't close. And it wasn't really a racially polarized thing. A lot of black people couldn't stand Cassius Clay. They thought he was a classless, undignified, loudmouthed buffoon. And when he joined the nation and became Muhammad Ali, a lot of black people started liking him even less, especially around Louisville, including some members of his own family. Cassius Clay was the name of a Kentucky slaveholder who had undergone a religious epiphany, freed his slaves, and became an abolitionist. So that name was held in great reverence by a lot of people in that area. And when Muhammad Ali started saying, Cassius Clay, that's a slave name, I don't answer to that slave name no more, it really rubbed a lot of black people in that area the wrong way. And as far as white America was concerned, when it was Clay versus Liston for the heavyweight title, it was basically choose your lesser of two evils. You had a champion in Liston who was owned by organized crime, who worked as a mob enforcer on the side, and this was widely known to the public. And you had a challenger in Clay who, though he hadn't yet publicly declared his name change and his religious affiliation, it was common knowledge that he had been spending a lot of time with Malcolm X. So if he wasn't officially in the Nation of Islam yet, then it was safe to say, to use the parlance of today, that he was Nation of Islam adjacent. So after the fight in Miami, you were going to continue having a heavyweight champion who was a member of the criminal underworld, or you were going to have a new champion who was a card-carrying black radical. And it's impossible for people today to understand what a big damn deal the heavyweight championship used to be. The heavyweight champion once occupied a position in the cultural landscape that really dwarfed any other sports figure. Americans wanted their heavyweight champion to be not just the best boxer, but an exemplar of the American ideal, the poster boy for everything the country likes about itself. Joe Louis held the heavyweight title for 12 years. He defended it 25 times, never said an unkind word about any of his opponents, and when the Army drafted him, he stepped forward and went and served honorably. That is what America expected from its heavyweight champion. And when the champion lived up to the country's expectations in terms of character and personal conduct, as Lewis did, as Rocky Marciano did, as Floyd Patterson did, the country repaid them with a lifetime of unconditional public affection. But Muhammad Ali, By virtue of being a black Muslim and a man without a modest bone in his body, he was already the most widely disliked man in America before he got drafted in 1967, by which time he had been the champion for over 3 years and defended the title a dozen times. And when his response to getting drafted was, "No, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong, and why should I go fight for a country where my people can't even sit at a lunch counter?" He went from being widely disliked to being utterly reviled. Because it seems hard to believe now, but in mid-1967, the Vietnam War still enjoyed something like 70% public support. Draft dodgers were seen as just about the lowest form of life. And now the heavyweight champion of the world, in addition to being an obnoxious braggart, in addition to being a black Muslim radical, now he was a cowardly draft dodger, too. In fact, one would have to look long and hard to find any figure in modern American history who was more disliked by more people for more reasons than Muhammad Ali was in 1967. But it took real moral courage to do what he did. He could have kept the title, done his time in the army the same way Joe Louis did by going around and doing boxing exhibitions for the troop, giving some speeches, selling some war bonds. They would have given him time off to train and defend the title occasionally, just like they did for Lewis. And he would have come out of it with a totally rehabilitated public image and the respect of a lot of the same people who couldn't stand him before. But he said, "No, I think this is wrong. It's contrary to the dictates of my conscience. It's antithetical to my religious beliefs, and I'm not going to do it." And most crucially, he was willing to give up everything he had, to be stripped of his title, to sacrifice the whole prime of his career, even to spend 5 years in federal prison in order to stand up for what he felt was right. And if you want to talk about how someone goes from being the most hated man in America to the most loved man in America, that's how you do it. By putting your money where your mouth is, by backing up your words with actions, by demonstrating the willingness to undergo privation and suffering in order to stand up for what you feel is right. Muhammad Ali was one of those people, and we need them to come along every once in a while who held up a mirror and said, "Okay, America, are you really as committed to your core foundational principles as you think you are? You pride yourself on religious freedom, but does that include religious freedom for obnoxious, loud-mouthed black Muslim radicals? You pride yourself on freedom of expression, but does that include the freedom for one to express one's opposition to and one's disinclination to participate in a war that one regards as immoral and unjust?" And of course, none of this can happen. This transition from revulsion to reverence can never take place without it being built on a foundation of professional excellence. If Cassius Clay had been just a good heavyweight, or even a great heavyweight, he never could have become the towering social and cultural figure that he eventually became. He has to be the greatest of all time in order for that to happen. He has to be the guy who's so good, he tells you what round he's going to knock your ass out, and then he does it. And then he does it to a dozen other guys. He has to be the guy who boasts like nobody ever boasted before, and then routinely backs up his boasting. But for as much as Muhammad Ali can and does and should receive credit for the part he played in making the United States a country that does a better job of living up to its own stated principles, he also engaged in acts of race huckstering that were unconscionable and indefensible, for which neither he nor anybody else should ever receive a free pass, irrespective of how much they're counterbalanced by good and altruistic deeds. And there were about half a dozen fights where Ali made a point of introducing racial controversies because he was trying to promote a fight and he thought it would be good for business. And maybe it was good for business. But that makes it no less revolting. Joe Frazier never forgave Ali for calling him an Uncle Tom and the white man's champion in the lead up to the first of their fights, and Ali never apologized to him for it. Now, remember how taken aback we all were back at the end of October, in the run-up to the California recall election, when the LA Times declared that Larry Elder was the black face of white supremacy? Was that shocking? Yes. Was it offensive? Yes. Was it unprecedented? Nope. It was not unprecedented. Because Muhammad Ali was hell-bent on making his first fight with Frazier into some sort of racial referendum. And he got a big assist from a young Bryant Gumbel who authored an op-ed for the Washington Post in which he posed the question, is Joe Frazier a white champion in a black body? It's not difficult to see why Frazier found this all more than a little bit confusing. He's like, okay, let me see if I got this straight. Cassius Clay grows up in the nicest black neighborhood in Louisville, while I was born in a sharecropper's shack in South Carolina. Clay's wearing nice clothes, going to a nice school, while I'm pushing a plow behind a mule. Clay gets to have a nice middle-class childhood because his mama works for the richest white family in town, but I'm the Uncle Tom here? How does that work again? And who the hell are any of us to say Frazier shouldn't have held a grudge over that, especially when Ali, who had such vast reserves of moral courage in other areas of life, could never bring himself to look Joe in his face and say he was sorry. It's a stain on his reputation, and it damn well should be a stain on his reputation. He did the same thing before the third Frazier fight, the Thrilla in Manila, when he famously did the act where he punches the little toy gorilla. There wasn't any reason for that, except the fact that gorilla rhymed with Manila, and there was no promotional justification for it because it's not like they needed any help hyping the fight or selling tickets. It's the final installment in the greatest trilogy in the history of boxing. So why introduce a racial narrative? Now, from Frazier's perspective, it looked like nothing but pointless cruelty, which it probably was, and it's a further stain on Ali's reputation. Just like what he did to Jerry Quarry was before their first fight. Again, this was a fight that didn't need any help promotionally. It was Ali's return to the ring after his 3.5-year enforced exile. All he had to do was beat Quarry, and he would get his title shot against Frazier. And Quarry didn't do anything wrong except being a white guy. But Ali started saying a bunch of racial stuff, implying that Quarry and his family were all a bunch of Irish redneck white supremacists, to the point where Quarry's parents started getting death threat calls from black radicals. Now, it's beyond argument that Muhammad Ali was a great American. It's beyond argument that all things considered in their totality, he did more to advance the cause of racial understanding than any American who has lived in recent history. But we should not forget about the bad things. And that can be difficult when the standard historical narrative that's been constructed is written from an exclusively pro-Ali point of view. But the fact of the matter is, Ali engaged in some unjustifiable acts of race hustling that would make Joy Reid and Al Sharpton blush. In boxing terms, if you treated Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali as separate fighters, they both would be among the top 10 heavyweights of all time. Cassius Clay finished his career as the undefeated heavyweight champion with a record of 20-0. Muhammad Ali finished with a record of 36-5, had 2 title reigns of his own, and they were profoundly different fighters, too. Clay was a heavyweight who moved like a middleweight, with quicker hands, quicker feet than anybody in that weight class before or since, a guy who was impossible to hit, who danced around his opponents while he mocked their inability to touch him, who met with the press after each fight and said, "See, look how pretty I am, not a mark on my face." Muhammad Ali, by contrast, was a guy who built his legend on the ability to take damage and withstand it. No one could have guessed, back during the heyday of Cassius Clay, that this man would one day be regarded as having the best chin in the history of the sport. He was a master ring tactician, the master psychologist, the guy who beat you by getting inside your head just as much as he did by punching you in the face. But most important of all, the man who was once Cassius Marcellus Clay, who became Muhammad Ali, his life stands as a refutation of the claims that this country's critics consistently level at it. That it's an intractably racist place, full of intractably racist people, who are incapable of improving themselves or of being anything else, who will always be defined by the racial and ethnic and religious resentments of their ancestors. But there it still is, that stubborn fact that refuses to go away. The most beloved American of the last half-century was a black Muslim. And so we now return you to your regularly scheduled race hustling. Thanks very much indeed for watching tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I will be back here with you on Monday. Here is wishing everyone a pleasant tomorrow. And until next time, do not comply. Get off my lawn.